What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I am Jordan, joined with Jared as always. And today we have our first repeat guest, Dr. Kipp Davis. How's it going, Kipp?
It's going well. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for coming
I
on.
am honored to be your first return guest. And surprised, I think, too. I thought you guys would have had like a shroud dude
Yeah,
back before
yeah.
me. Or is the shroud played out? Is it
Oh no,
The shroud is never played out.
Shroud it's an eternal well. No, we haven't had too many Shroud people on. We've had plenty of people yelling at us in the comments, but we haven't had too many Shroudies on the actual channel. Maybe we should do that one of these days.
not shroudies themselves. But
Right.
you had the one guy on who was really good, the
Hugh Ferry?
English
Yeah.
guy. Yeah.
We
I
should get
really
Hugh
liked
back on.
him.
That was very entertaining. Yeah.
That was. He
But
should be your second returning guest.
But today we're not talking about the Shroud of Turin.
No.
We are talking about the Bible, specifically prophecies in the Bible. So this came up because a very common argument we hear from Christians about why you can believe that the Bible is true or that Jesus returned from the dead or whatever is that prophecy was fulfilled. And usually they're referring to prophecy found in the Old Testament. And so we thought we'd get Kipp on to talk about biblical prophecy, where it comes from, how was it viewed in its original context by the people who wrote it, the people who were intended to read it, and whether any of these prophecies that are usually pointed to were actually fulfilled reasonably. So,
and Christians have a long history of like looking to the Hebrew scriptures and mining it for stuff to prove their point. A lot of the early church fathers did this as well. And so a lot of what you hear from Christians today can be traced back to some of that stuff. My favorite church father, Origen, had like this 3 levels of the scriptures, the body, the soul, and the spirit. And you felt you could read something into every little thing, even like simple stuff like don't eat shrimp would be meaning something in the spiritual world. And so, but the people who wrote the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament weren't actually Christians and didn't do that way. So we thought we could bring Kipp on here to see, like, what did the people who actually wrote it, how did they view these prophecies?
I feel like Origen and then maybe later Augustine. I have a soft spot for them as perhaps pioneers in the development of what we might call later, much later on, Christian. It was like nascent critical biblical scholarship where, they came to recognize, hey, you know what? The text, it like means it means a whole bunch of different things. And it sort of introduced this idea that you can just ignore. You can recognize that, yeah, the text says something completely different than what I think it means, but then you can ignore that.
Right.
So,
Wasn't it Origen who put together like there was 8 different translations and he put them all together so he could look at them? It was like the
the Sour Hexapla.
Was that him that did that?
Yeah, that's Origen's work. And we don't
Yeah.
we have fragments of 1 or 2 manuscripts of the Sour Hexapla, I believe. But it's pretty wild.
Wow.
And good for Origen, right? To feel as to be as concerned about the text as he was to decide to do that, right?
Well, a lot of good it did him.
That
He was deemed a
impresses me.
heretic and then,
I know.
ostracized.
well, I mean, who isn't a heretic, really?
It's true. It's true. You just had to, if you were a heretic in your hometown, you just had to move.
That's right.
And someone else was, yeah.
So before we dive into this, real quick, Kipp, you've got actually, I think one of the things that kind of prompted me to reach out to you, you've been doing a series on your channel about prophecy. So you want to tell everybody a little bit about that so they can go check that out when they're done with this?
Yeah, totally. So I've got a long form series all about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's really in depth. By the time I'm done, there's going to be like 30 hours of information all about the Dead Sea Scrolls for free for everyone, which is, I think, pretty great. But I've now finished 6 parts of this series. There are 4, I think, that are published on YouTube. There's one more coming this week, and then I still have another one that's available on my Patreon. I'm very excited about it because it's just super fun. It features a special guest, a super secret special guest, and it delves into the issues of canon, understanding the canon of scripture relative to early Jewish literature, and this important connection that constantly gets made to Star Wars. So,
Hmm.
if you
So
love Star Wars, if you love
if people wanted to watch that early and they didn't want to wait for it, how would they do that?
they would go and sign up at my Patreon for
Oh,
as
wow.
little as $4 a month, and you can get early access to all my videos if you just can't wait, if you need to
Pe-
find out what's going on. So,
People need to do
yeah,
that.
And the
they
rapture could happen any day now, so you don't
Yeah,
want
so
to
you,
wait.
you don't
Yeah,
want to wait. Yeah.
correct.
it could. So, but I think what Jordan is referencing is the 4th video in. Okay, so no, there are more than 6, aren't there? Sorry, I've already lost count. But in the 4th video, which is called the prophet, it's like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pesherim and prophecy, and it's exploring this idea of how early Jews thought about their texts, how they thought about them as inspired or God's word or as prophetic, and ways in which they develop those ideas in their own time relative to their own situation. So and I bet that's why Jordan reached out, because he saw the series and he went, wow, that's a great idea. Kipp seems to know something about this.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
since you brought it up, why don't you paint the picture for us? How did Jews in their own time, the people who were writing, the audience these were written to, how did they perceive these prophecies? What was the kind of mindset there?
So I've got now I'll say something else here quickly. I have, in addition to the stuff that I do on my YouTube channel with the Dead Sea Scrolls, I actually have a whole online course all about religion in the Old Testament. The people who practiced, uh, the people who wrote the text of the Old Testament, the religions they practice, and the evidence for that, and how the Bible represents that. I have a whole course devoted to that, and within my 18 lecture course, which is available at MVP courses, I'm just chilling. It's chill time for me. The one of the lectures that I teach in this course is all about prophecy in early Israel. So, in preparation for today, I thought I would just pull out some of the material directly from my course and walk through a few things. So, if I can share my screen, and to start, what I thought I'd do, I know you guys you guys sent me. I want to share the entire screen.
Yeah.
There we
We
go.
sent you an
Okay.
outline and you just threw it out the window. And
And I just tossed it. I said, nah, we're not doing that. Well, no, I've actually tried to follow some of the outline. So, but I thought it's important to start from addressing this question of where did all of this begin? Who were prophets, and what the heck were they doing back in early Israel, in the pre-Jewish period? I'll just make one qualification here. When we talk about Judaism from a scholarly perspective, we're talking about the religion that developed in Palestine and in communities of like-minded people in Egypt and in Babylon, which developed out of this old Israelite temple religion that was practiced in Palestine during the early to the mid part of the Iron Age. So, and this is where this idea of prophets and prophecy kind of emerged, and where it sort of began. So, right away, it's important to note that originally, a prophet, and the Hebrew word is navi, just prophet. The prophet was an important part of the royal retinue in the ancient Near Eastern world, not just in Israel, but throughout the ancient Near East. We know about prophets from all sorts of different kinds of texts, in particular, uh, significantly from the Mari tablets, which date to the 18th century BCE. So these were discovered in 1933, and they comprise over 20,000 cuneiform texts, most of which are royal correspondences from the king to his subjects and to other nations. Within this archive, though, survive a number of very interesting prophecies that were delivered to the Mari king. His name was Zimri Lim. And there's some connection implied in these prophecies to the royal chapel or to the temple where the king worshipped his gods. So yeah, so and this can, while this connection is uncertain, a number of these figures appear to be court or temple singers of some sort. And interestingly, in Mari at least, prophets seem to have probably been eunuchs. So that's sort of the background. Prophets, within the Mari tablets, are called answerers, ecstatics, diviners, which is a cognate for the word prophet in Hebrew. They were connected to the royal chapel. They were probably eunuchs.
What a rough job. That's
I know, right?
that's going to be a hard pass.
You may not have had a choice. I don't know. You may have somebody might have seen potential and just decided to capitalize on that. So we see examples of court prophets within the Hebrew Bible. Most famously, Nathan was the court prophet of David, the second king of the supposedly United Kingdom of Israel. And we read about him fairly extensively in 2 Samuel chapter 7, in chapter 12, and in 1 Kings chapter 1. So just a couple of passages here from the Bible. In 2 Samuel 7, verses 1 to 3, it says, when the king was settled in his palace and Yahweh had given him safety from all the enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, here I am dwelling in this house of cedar, while the ark of Yahweh abides in a tent. Nathan said to the king, go and do whatever you have in mind, for Yahweh is with you. So, and this seems to be the function of Nathan. The function of court prophets throughout the ancient Near East was in an advisory capacity. Kings would consult prophets in an effort to see if they could receive some special insight from the gods, believing that the prophet had a direct conduit of communication to the gods. So this is basically what David is doing. But there's one instance where Nathan actually, unprompted, comes to David and will and heavily criticizes his way of doing things. We read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 12. In 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 7 to 8, this is actually a text that I am reading with my good friend and colleague Joshua Bowen. We're doing Hebrew readings on my channel 2 Thursdays a month. Every second Thursday, we're doing it this week. We're in verse 5 right now.
Don't understand the word Hebrew, but it was very entertaining anyway. So
all right, good stuff. So in 1 Kings chapter 1, one of David's sons mounts an attempted coup. He attempts to David is old, and he sees his chance to take hold of the kingdom. And we read in verse 7 to 8, that the words of Adonijah, his son, were with Joab, son of Zeruiah, and Abiathar, the priest, and they supported Adonijah. So these are the people who backed Adonijah in his rebellion. But then we read that I didn't include the text. We then read of those who continued to support David, and they were Beniyahu, the son of Jehoiada, and then another priest by the name of Zadok, and importantly Nathan, the prophet, was a supporter of David. So prophets originally were basically just advisors. They had special connections to the gods, and the king would consult them for advice.
Kind of
We
like
see some,
a priestly position, sort of, to
yeah.
way to them to, but not necessarily. So they're kind of like providing that viewpoint in the court, but not necessarily projecting forward as people would normally think of prophecy or prophets today.
Not so much, and we'll talk through a couple of texts. I've got a couple of examples of texts, and we'll talk through a few of these just to get a sense of what prophets did in the Old Kingdom in this early period, in like the early to mid Iron Age. So, one of my favorite stories of an encounter with the prophets appears in 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 1 to 8. So, and I'll just read the whole thing here for you. There was a lull of 3 years with no war between Aram and Israel. Israel is the northern kingdom. In the 3rd year, King Jehoshaphat of Judah came to visit the king of Israel. Even though he's unnamed, this is the king Ahab. The king of Israel said to his courtiers, "You know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, and yet we do nothing to recover it from the hands of the king of Aram." He said to Jehoshaphat, "Will you come with me to battle at Ramoth Gilead?" So he's asking him if he'll ally with him and help him to go and get his territory back. Jehoshaphat answered the king, "I will do what you do. My troops will be your troops. My horses shall be your horses." But Jehoshaphat said further to the king of Israel, "Please inquire first of Yahweh." So the king of Israel gathered the prophets, about 400 men, and asked them, "Shall I march upon Ramoth Gilead for battle, or shall I not?" And the answer from these 400 prophets who have been gathered is resounding. "March," they said, "and my Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." Then Jehoshaphat, the king from the southern kingdom, Judah, asked, "Isn't there another prophet of Yahweh here through whom we can inquire?" He's suspicious, right? All of these, like 400 prophets, and they all have this same unanimous answer, strikes him as suspicious. He's got this sense that, oh, these guys are a bunch of yes men. So he's like, come on, isn't there somebody else out there who we might inquire of Yahweh? So the king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat and said, and you can hear it in his voice when he says this. I like to think that he sighs, "There is one more man through whom we can inquire of Yahweh, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, only misfortune. And his name is Micaiah, the son of Imlah." So I'm not going to read any more of the story, but it's pretty great because Micaiah, the son of Imlah, actually is given he gives the king, intentionally gives the king bad advice, and the king loses, and the king gets very angry with him. But and then disaster ensues. It's a great story, but it's a story which I think illustrates the point here pretty clearly. The office of the prophet. This was an institution. This was a job that people had within the royal court, and it seems functionally different from how we tend to think of it in the modern day, from how we know it through the Hebrew prophets, which is this large collection of literature in the Old Testament. So, simply put, the prophets at first were diviners, and connected to the royal court initially, and they were depended on by kings to provide them invaluable advice in terms of, well, what the gods wanted them to do.
So kind of like a court magician or a court priest who could say, the king could say, I want to do this. How do the gods feel about that?
Yeah, exactly. And as you can see, um, I think the story. One of the things that the story from First Kings chapter 8 illustrates in the response of Jehoshaphat is that uh, there wasn't. I don't think there was an expectation that all your prophets were going to provide you the same advice.
Okay.
There could be some competing opinions, and like any modern ruler who surrounds themselves with an advisory council, he's going to weigh the options. So yeah, that's kind of where it begins.
So how do we move from there to prophets being kind of just a role, an advisory role, a sort of diviner of the divine will, to the more modern understanding of a prophet who's like making predictions into the future that come true?
Yeah. So this happens. I think this happens. There's no there's there's nothing that we can clearly map onto history here, but I think this is something that happens fairly progressively over a long period of time, whereby you'll see on the slide here, I say that diviners and court prophets were sharp critics of institutionalized kingship. I think smart rulers would not just have yes men in their courts. They would have people who challenged their opinions, like Micah, son of Imlah. Uh, and this is where some of the ideals and the sense of what I have called non-titled or non-institutionalized prophets sort of came from. They came out of this idea of resistance to the ruling administration. But some of this goes back much further back than even the period of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. We see we see before Saul becomes the king in Jerusalem, or sorry, in Gibeah, that there's earlier attempts to establish a monarchy that all fail. And interestingly, there's preserved in some of these early texts in the Judges um, reports or echoes of voices from people who don't want to have a king. Um, and I think the nature of what we understand to be prophecy as it appears in the Hebrew Bible kind of comes out of this resistance to the monarchy. So there's a story in Judges chapter 9 of Abimelech, who is made the king in Shechem. Shechem is later becomes the city Samaria, where the northern kingdom was centered. So Abimelech becomes the king in Shechem, but there is a man who is a fierce opponent to just this very idea of institutionalized kingship. And his name is Jotham, and he delivers this very neat parable. And I think that this is illustrative of sort of where this idea of state resistance and prophecy kind of go hand in hand, where the hand meets the glove. And I'll just read the text here for you now, starting in verse 7 through 15. So this is Jotham speaking. Well, first of all, it says, all the lords of Shechem gathered, and everyone of Bet Milo. They went and made Abimelech the king at the standing terebinth. This is like a deity, a cult object, which is in Shechem. When Jotham was informed, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim. He raised his voice, called out, and said, listen to me, lords of Shechem, and God will listen to you. So he's basically projecting himself as a deliverer of a message from God. If you listen to me, God's going to listen to you. Then he tells this really neat parable. The trees went to anoint a king over themselves. They said first to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree replied, have I, through whom God and men were honored, stopped yielding my rich oil that I should go and wave above the trees? So the trees then said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree replied, have I stopped yielding my sweetness, my delicious fruit, that I should go and wave above the trees? So the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine replied, have I stopped yielding my new wine, which gladdens God and men, that I should go and wave above the trees? Then all the trees said to the thorn bush, you come and reign over us. And the thorn bush said to the trees, if you are acting honorably in anointing me king over you, come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, may fire issue from the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon. So he tells this parable. As you listen to this, what do you think the moral of this story is? What is the message that's being communicated by Jotham to the people of Shechem in this cute little story of trees?
Well, the first few trees don't seem too keen about being put in charge, because like they've basically got a role that was ordained by God that's going well, and to do otherwise would be to go outside of what God ordained. That's what I get from it.
Yeah. Why is the thorn bush so eager to take the job?
Presumably, the thorn bush is a jerk and is not a good tree.
I like it. Yeah, it's I like the conclusion that James Kugel, he taught Bible at Harvard for many years, but he says of this story, only worthless, low, power hungry scoundrels are interested in ruling. So
You know
this
what?
is
I endorse this message, and
it's a good parable, right?
Yeah.
But this, I think, is exemplary of early prophecy. This is it's a critique of the administration. It's a popular level grassroots condemnation of the rulers. And this is sort of where this idea of prophets as being proclaimers of the word of God, for the common people, sort of comes from. And these are people we know of. These are I've distinguished between what I call prophets who are part of the royal retinue, and non-titled prophets, or prophets who seem to just rise up out of the populace. So Isaiah Ben Amoz, famously, he's got a book with like 66 chapters in it named after him. He's closely connected to the court of the king. He's an associate of the kings, in particular Ahaz and Hezekiah. But we have examples of these other non-title prophets. One of the most interesting is this fellow by the name of Balaam, son of Beor, and we read about him in Numbers. I think it's chapter 22 through 24. He's called upon by I believe it's the king of Moab. At this time, the Israelites are approaching the promised land. They haven't entered the promised land. Moab, the king of Moab, is really nervous about this. So he calls on this prophet Balaam to basically call down the curses of God upon the Israelites in order to stop them from taking his land. So in an example of what Balaam would do, he would hire himself out in this instance to anybody who needed his services. He wasn't attached to the court of the king of Moab. He was like a prophet for hire,
a mercenary wizard,
a mercenary prophets, exactly. So Numbers 24, 4-5. we read the word of Balaam, son of Beor, word of the man whose eye is true, word of him who hears God's speech, who beholds visions from the Almighty, prostrate, but with eyes unveiled. And he would deliver these oracles for the king of Moab. Balaam's really interesting because we actually know about him outside of the Bible. Balaam is actually mentioned in this very interesting plaster in scripture from Tel Deir Allah, which comes from about 700 BCE. And I think this is a key point in terms of how we think about dating some of these texts too. Most likely, 700 BCE is right around the time of when we think some of these stories featuring Balaam would have been told and, eventually written down. Balaam appears to have been a fairly well-known, widely traveled prophet in the region. So we've got this really interesting plaster inscription. I'll read a little bit of this to you. It says, "This is the inscription of Balaam, son of Beor. He was a divine seer, and the gods came to him at night, and they spoke to him according to the vision of El. And they said to Balaam, son of Beor, this will there's a break here, do in the future. No man has seen what you have heard." And Balaam rose on the next day. There's some broken parts of the text. It goes on to say, "He wept, and his people came to him, and they said to Balaam, son of Beor, why do you fast? Why do you weep?" And he said to them, "Be seated, and I will show you what the Shaddayim have done. And go, behold the workings of the Elohim," or the gods. "The Elohim have joined forces, and the Shaddayim," these are like dark spirits, the Shaddayim. So the Shaddayim have established counsel, and they have said to Shagar, "We Yishtar, sew up the cover of heavens in dense clouds, so that darkness, not brilliance, will be there. Concealment and not bristling, or light perhaps, that you may instill dread. Darkness, and never raise your voice again. For the swift crane will shriek insult to the eagle, and the voice of vultures will resound. Distress and trouble. The chicks of the heron, sparrow and cluster of eagles, pigeons and birds of," and on and on and on it goes. So he's sort of he functions in a similar sense as like your court prophets, except he's not actually attached directly to an individual king or an individual temple. He's a mercenary, and he seems to speak on behalf of not just one God, not just the God Yahweh. Within this text, he speaks for El. He talks about the Elohim, or the gods within a divine council. It's a very, very cool, very interesting text.
Would
So,
you?
sorry, go ahead.
So that one seems to be written in between Assyrian and Babylonian exiles. How much of that? So when I'm looking back at some of these prophets, it seems like a lot of them, in my mind, were always written ex post facto, like looking back on situations. Um,
Yeah,
but you're saying there was a history of prophets that kind of led up to where we get to like
yeah.
messianic, what we would consider messianic prophets.
Yeah. So exactly. And we'll talk about that a little bit now. Uh the man of God in First Kings 13 is another one of my favorites. We all know about Elijah in First Kings chapter 18. So what basically happened, things went this way for, many years. Um Prophets would advise the king within the court. Uh, Prophets would rise up from among the common people to provide cri- outside critiques of the office of the king and his administration, and how seriously the actual rulers took these people. We have no idea. We don't know how they came from. Some of these people came out of these outsider classes into the halls of power. So yeah, so what about Messianic prophecies?
So yeah, what is a messianic prophecy? Just
Yeah.
before we dive
So
into it.
first of all, let's talk about let's talk about what happened. Um, the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, is destroyed by Assyria in 722 BCE. So the kingdom's done. It's over. There's a mass migration of people south into Judah, into Jerusalem, which is the ruling seat of the house of David, and it lasts for another 150 years thereabouts, up until 586 BCE, when ultimately the Babylonians come and they conquer Jerusalem. They destroy the temple and they exile all the leading citizens. These are people who, this was the purpose of exile, was to take anybody who could cause trouble back home with you, where you can keep an eye on them. So they didn't take everybody with them. They just took people who had means, wealthy people, people who were part of the aristocracy, part of the temple. These are the people who went into exile in Babylon. And it's during this period where the office of prophets starts to shift. The sharp critiques of the earlier prophets against the institution of the king started to become uh, fulfillments. They started to be viewed as fulfillments of the sins of the people. The kingdom of Judah was destroyed, and the kingdom of Israel were destroyed because their administrations were corrupt, because their kings did not pay proper respect to Yahweh. And so many of these prophecies, which were collected earlier, which were part of this, part of these inside and outside critiques of the administration in the moment, started to be viewed as predictions of what was going to happen and fulfillments of those predictions. So, and this goes in a couple of different directions. On the one hand, you have this anti-monarchic propaganda starts to become very fiercely critical of the current rulers, and starts to look forward to a day when there will be an ideal king who is going to come and finally, sit on the throne, on David's throne in Judah. Jeremiah, this is a satisfaction of the words spoken by Yahweh to Solomon in 2 Samuel chapter 7. He promises that he will have an eternal kingdom. And of course, when the Babylonian exile, when the conquest of Jerusalem happens, it ends the kingdom. David's dynasty is broken, and people are looking and going, well, this promise can't be wrong. It must be fulfilled in this ideal divine kingship. So this is sort of the direction you start to see some of this rhetoric. Jeremiah is particularly famous as a fierce opponent of the kings in Jerusalem in his lifetime, and he starts to project forward to this time when there will be an ideal king. I'll read just a section of interesting text from Jeremiah 33 to illustrate this. So this is Jeremiah proclaiming. He says, "Thus says Yahweh of armies," or Yahweh Tzebaot, "in this ruined place." So he's speaking after the Babylonians have just razed the entire city and broken the Davidic line. He says, "In this ruined place, without man and beast, and in all of its towns, there shall be again a pasture for shepherds, where they can rest their flocks. In the towns of the hill country, in the towns of the Shephelah, in the towns of the Negev, in the land of Benjamin, and in the environs of Jerusalem, and in the towns of Judah. Sheep shall pass again under the hands of one who counts them, said Yahweh. See, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will fulfill the promise I made concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will raise up a true branch. And the Hebrew here is Tzemach Tzedakah, of David's line, and he shall do what is right in the land. In those days, Judah shall be delivered, and Israel shall dwell secure. And this is what he shall be called. He shall be called Yahweh Tzedekenu, which means Yahweh is a righteousness. Importantly, this name forms a play on words with the name of the last king of Judah, Tzedekyahu, of whom Jeremiah was fiercely critical. For thus says Yahweh, there shall never be an end to men of David's line who sit upon the throne of the house of Israel, nor shall there ever be an end to the line of the Levitical priests before me, of those who present burnt offerings and turn meal offerings into smoke and perform sacrifices. So this message then is meant to denigrate the current regime, which has just been broken by the Babylonian invasion, but by drawing it into contrast with the future perfect regime that would be led by God's anointed ruler in the distant future. And this is where this word Messiah comes from. It's a transliteration of the Hebrew word Mashiach, which just means the anointed one. It's applied within the Old Testament to kings when they assume the office of the kingdom, or to priests when they assume their office within the temple. Over time, of course, so that's it for my presentation. But over time, this is basically this idea gets turned into an expectation for this idealized figure who's going to come back and finally fix all of Judah's problems. And this is the feature of much of the writing and the thinking throughout the Second Temple period, leading up through the life of Jesus and into up to the destruction of the Second Temple and beyond. Even is this idea that an ideal ruler from the line of David, who's going to be divinely empowered, is going to come and restore the nation.
So, looking at the development, you started with prophets who are like courtly priests to advise the king and kind of divine the will of the gods for the purpose of the court. Then you led to more of like a kind of a street preacher feel. I'm criticizing what's going on. I'm speaking for God, and God's saying this about what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then as calamity strikes and the kings are failing, they've been conquered and everything, they looked back at those critiques and kind of brought them to their current.
They were right.
Yeah, they were right. Yeah.
Right.
And so that, I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, that kind of signaled almost a tonal shift from this. I'm talking about what's happening right now to they may have been talking about what's happening right then, but also they were talking about what's happening to us now today.
See, I think this is the thing that people invariably miss all the time when it comes to understanding prophecy within the ancient world. It didn't have to do with the distant future. Almost never. Prophecies were about what's happening to us in the moment. Even within the like the Hebrew prophets who were serving in the court, it all had to do with. I mean, you look at Jehoshaphat and Ahab. Should we go and fight the king of Edom today? What's going to be the result? And the prophets say, yeah, go do it. So this is basically what prophecy looks like in the ancient world.
I can imagine the king's like, hey, should I do this invasion? And the prophet's like, in 4,000 years, there's going to be this war. And the king's like, cool. So anyway, can we talk
Who cares,
about,
right? It's like, I don't care about that. I'm concerned about what's happening now.
Okay.
So,
okay.
And that's, yeah.
So moving out of that sort of that regime, we get into the books that Christians today look back and project kind of like Messianic expectations on.
Yeah.
Before we're gonna dive, we have like a list of like some prophecies that Christians often point to, and we'll talk about some of them. Is it fair to say that modern Christians, or even Christians since the last 2,000 years, are projecting like projecting meaning that wasn't intended to be there by the original authors and audiences in terms of like this messianic
Absolutely.
expectation?
So, but I think too, there's a couple things to point out here, or one, well, at least one that's particularly salient, is that the when Christians do this, when Christians have done this over centuries, millennia now, they're not doing anything unusual or untoward at all, because this is basically how Jews continued to read their ancient texts. Everything began to take on these cryptic meanings. They became imbued with this special numinous quality, I would say, whereby they're coded messages. It
Just
might
crack open
say
the
one
Talmud anywhere.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
But even I think even closer to home, you just look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is what we see. And the scrolls provide a really excellent analog, because these are texts written by a Jewish community shortly before the emergence of Christianity. And it's interesting because what we see taking place in the scrolls is very, very similar to what we see taking place throughout the New Testament.
Hmm.
So, and if you want, we can. You guys had asked me to provide like a couple of examples of how this plays out. So,
Yeah, I think it's illustrative because a lot of the audience and people who are Christians will be very familiar with the prophecies they're familiar with, but these prophecies were being written down or interpreted or read in a broader context, and I think it's useful to see like what were other very similar religious groups doing at the time.
yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get to, well, we'll touch on one here in a few minutes, where an example of where Christians and the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls are even looking at the exact same text and coming up with, different meanings. So,
Wait. It might be ambiguous and open into interpretation. What are you talking about? Heresy.
the meaning is so the early Jews, and the early Christians who were originally Jews, they were they were absolutely they were huge proponents of this reader response kind of approach to the text. What does it mean? What do I think it means? How can I pretzel it enough to make it mean what I want it to mean? Is the order of the day when it comes to these texts. So we have a couple of examples in the scrolls of them forward looking. Now, importantly, it's important to note that they're not looking very far into the distant future, because for the people who wrote and collected the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believed that they were living like on the brink. They were on the edge. The last days were coming at any moment. Um, God and his army was going to come back and destroy the Romans and establish, an eternal kingdom
Where have we
in
heard that
their
before?
lifetime.
Where have we heard that before?
Right? This is the Christian message. So, so they understood that this was going to be imminent, but it's something that they were still looking forward to and projecting and making predictions about. So, the most famous example of this is a large text known as the War Scroll. It was found in Cave 1, and there were other copies or things that look similar to it found in Cave 4, which basically narrates how the battle's going to go. The sons of light are going to do battle with the sons of darkness. There's going to be 7 individual campaigns. The sons of light and God are going to win 3, and the sons of darkness and Belial are going to win 3. And then in the final one, God's going to finally break through and have total victory, right? And for importantly too, for the people who wrote and collected the Dead Sea Scrolls, the vanquishing of their enemies meant total destruction, and it wasn't just the Romans or even the nations; it was everybody who disagreed with them. It was there's these ideas that are replete throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls about purifying the land of, you know, these impure rival forms of practicing Judaism. So, you know, now they were famously pacifists in that they wouldn't engage in violent conflict themselves, but they harbored uh these fantasies of God basically coming in and killing all their enemies for them.
Sounds like
So
the Southern bless your heart version of
yeah, right.
it's like, I'm
Yeah.
not gonna do it, but it sure would be a
Yeah.
shame if God came along and destroyed you vile
Right.
heretics.
Okay. Yeah. So I've got a couple of examples of this. There's one text. Its catalog number is 4Q285. It's called The War Rule. And I'll just give you a sampling of this. Part of it reads like this. This is from fragment 7, lines 1 to 6. Just as it is written in the book of Isaiah the prophet, and the thickets of the forest shall be cut down with an axe, and Lebanon with its majestic trees will fall. A shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse, and a branch, a tzemach is the word, shall grow out of his roots. And that's Isaiah chapter 10, verse 34 through 11:1. So that's the text. And the War Rule quotes the whole text, and then it offers an interpretation, and it says, this is the branch of David. Then all the forces of Belial, this is the bad guy, the cosmic bad guy, shall be judged. And the king of the Kittim are the Romans. The king of the Kittim shall stand for judgment, and the leader of the congregation, the branch of David, will have him put to death. Then all Israel shall come out with timbrels and dancers, and the high priest shall order them to cleanse their bodies from the guilty blood of the corpses of the Kittim. So, and they get all that from Isaiah chapter 10, verses 34 through 11, verse 1. So there's I'll give you another one here. This is a scroll from Cave 11, which is called the Melchizedek scroll. And this is from fragment 2, column 2, lines 8 through 13. For this is the time decreed for the year of Melchizedek's favor. Now, this is playing on Isaiah 61, verse 2. But interestingly, this scroll has replaced the year of Yahweh's favor with Melchizedek. So this is now the text basically equating Melchizedek with Yahweh. This is the year of Melchizedek's favor. And for his hosts or armies together with the holy ones of God, these are angels, for a kingdom of judgment, just as it is written about him in the songs of David. And here's the quotation from the Psalms. A godlike being has taken his place in the council of God. In the midst of the divine beings, he holds judgment. That's Psalm 82, verse 1. It goes on to provide the interpretation. This scripture also says of him, over it, take your seat in the highest heaven. A divine being will judge the peoples. That's Psalm 7, verses 7 to 8. Concerning what the scripture says, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? That's Psalm 82, verse 2. The interpretation applies to Belial and the spirits predestined to him, because all of them have rebelled, turning from God's precepts and so becoming utterly wicked. Therefore, Melchizedek will thoroughly prosecute the vengeance required by God's statutes. In that day, he will deliver them from the power of Belial and from the power of all the spirits predestined to him. The text goes on to talk about this occurring on the Day of Atonement after the 70th Jubilee, it's the 70th Jubilee, which is, sorry, yeah, I think that's right, or the 70th week, sorry, which is related to Daniel's prophecies in chapter 9. So they are forward looking. They're using earlier texts of scripture to inform them about what's going to happen, but importantly, this is stuff that they expect to happen like tomorrow.
Okay, so it seems like the earliest Christians who were an apocalyptic cult and were also predicting the imminent end of the earth, they were at home in their Jewish context, being Jews themselves, and looking back to their scriptures and pulling meaning for the things that they believed were going to happen right now. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and I think this leads into, we see some of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but what we see most of the time is what I consider, and this is sort of the theme of the video that I made in my series, what I would consider prophecy, but it's all after the fact and it's backwards looking. It's saying, here's what our ancestors, the Hebrew prophets, predicted about what was going to happen, and we've seen the fulfillment of that in our lifetimes. So you have many examples of this sort of thing. I've pulled up a few by way of illustration. So one of my favorites is in a text called the Community Rule, also known as 1QS. In column 8, lines 12 through 16. And the reason this text is really interesting is because it relies upon a prophecy from Isaiah that's also used by Christians and applied to Jesus. So here's a different way of reading Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. When such men as these come to be in Israel, conforming to these doctrines, they shall separate from the session of perverse men to go to the wilderness and to prepare the way of truth as it is written. So basically, it's setting the stage and saying our community is formed of these men who are deeply concerned about, the signs of the times and the last days approaching, and the horrible corruption that's taking place within the Jerusalem temple and in the city of Jerusalem. So they cite Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, which says, in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And they provide this interpretation. This means the expounding of the Torah, decreed by God through Moses for obedience, that being defined by what has been revealed for each age and by what the prophets have revealed for his Holy Spirit. Now, this is probably, I hope this is a text that you guys, former Christians yourselves, recognize. Isaiah 43, in the wilderness, go and prepare a way.
Right. There have been several hymns about this. Yeah.
Yes, right. So what I mean, what's the Christian interpretation of this text?
Jared, you went to seminary.
Oh yeah.
but
Go, Jared.
I didn't pay attention though.
Oh, okay.
No. So I mean, typically John the Baptist is brought to mind here
Yes.
sometimes. Yeah. So
yes, exactly. So there's something very interesting that's happening here, though. When Matthew, well, it actually appears in all four Gospels, Isaiah 40, verse 3, and it's applied to John the Baptist. But when the Gospel writers, the first being Mark, when he cites this passage, he says that Isaiah said, there is a voice crying in the wilderness, comma, go and prepare the way of Yahweh, make straight the paths for your God. When the people who wrote the community role read this text, and they read it properly, like they're the ones who actually read the text closer to what its original intention was. When they read it, they said, there's a voice crying out, comma, in the wilderness, go and prepare a way for Yahweh, make straight the path for our God. So they
Quotations.
saw it as a mandate saying, you got to go in the wilderness to do this. Whereas the Christians saw this as John was in the wilderness and this is what he was doing. It's a subtle difference, but it's really important. And I think it's very illustrative of how malleable these texts can be, right? It's a single, like, not a single part of the text has not changed. All that's changed is the placement of the comma, and it affects the whole meaning of the text.
Wow.
So, but this is typical. This is how most of the Dead Sea Scrolls understand the Old Testament text. There's a whole collection of scrolls from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which scholars have designated as peshers, or pesherim is the plural. These have been described as commentaries on the Bible, whereby they're following through the text of a particular book. There's, one dedicated to the first few chapters of Habakkuk, one dedicated to Nahum, one to Micah. There's peshers to Psalms, to Isaiah. So they follow through the text basically line by line. It quotes a text of the scripture, and then it provides an interpretation, and then it moves on to the next text. So I'll just read a little bit to give you a sense of how this works out in the Pesher Nahum. So this is from fragments 3 to 4, column 1, lines 6 to 12. The quotation begins with Nahum chapter 2, verse 12, the second part. He fills his cave with prey, his den with game. So that's the quotation. And then the text goes on to say, this is the interpretation, right? This refers to the lion of wrath, vengeance against the flattery seekers. This is the halakot, the dorshe halakot, the seekers of flattery, which is a play on words of the dorshe halakot, the seekers of halakha, or the way. This is the pet name that the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls gave to the Pharisees. It's very tongue-in-cheek. They called them the seekers of smooth things, or the seekers of flattery. So vengeance against the flattery seekers, because he used to hang men alive, as it was done in Israel in former times for anyone hanging alive on a tree. The verse applies, behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. So that's Nahum now 2, verse 13. I will burn your smoke, your horde. The sword will consume your lions, and I will annihilate its prey from your land. Your messenger's voice shall no longer be heard. That's the rest of verse 13. The meaning of the passage, your horde are the troops of his army, which are in Jerusalem. Its lions are his nobles. Its prey is the wealth that the priests of Jerusalem gathered, which they give to somebody. It's blank there. So basically, what the writers of this text are doing is they're reading Nahum, and they're saying they're looking at these ancient prophecies delivered hundreds of years ago in a completely different historical context, and they're saying, oh, but this is code. So wherever it says the lion of wrath, this is with reference to this Gentile ruler. Wherever it says what does it say? The horde, these are the troops of the army who are in Jerusalem. The prey is the wealth of the Jerusalem temple that they've obtained through corruption. So they're basically reading the text as like a cipher for understanding what's going on now, or what just happened. Quite often what we read in the Dead Sea Scrolls are applications of these prophecies to things that they've just gone through, stuff that's just happened to them. And for them, it makes it real. It's almost a form of history telling, whereby they say, this happened, but look, it was predicted by the prophets way in the distant past. This means it's
It's a
significant, it's
justification.
meaningful.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
justification. Yeah.
It's interesting to see how that like usage of the text evolved throughout the centuries from where
Right.
it started. And it's also, I think, important, and Free Thinker says something kind of along the lines that he says, Isaiah 9 definitively prophesies
Oh
Jesus did
yeah.
not say this, right? So like, and what you're getting at here, they're using these texts, and sometimes even the same text that Christians use, and getting completely different views from it.
Well, I
So
think
I think go ahead. I'll
yeah,
say something first, and then you go, Jared. I think importantly, this does two things. First of all, this illustrates to us, on the one hand, the first Christians were not doing anything different from anybody else within Judaism. But I think, on the second hand, importantly, this points out that the prophecies, as they're applied to Jesus, as they're applied to the church, are nothing special.
that's
Yeah.
exactly what I was going to say. It's
It-
like this is nothing new, and the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of paint us a picture for us around the turn of the century of this commentary on prophecy for the past to shed light on current conditions, and the Christians were doing just that when they were writing the Gospels. And
Exactly the same thing.
Right. And it seems like
And I,
it seems odd to privilege, like you almost have to like put blinders on to privilege like the prophecies that are handed to you from the books that you have bound in the book of the Bible now, right?
right,
To look at those
exactly.
and say these prophecies are pointing to the thing I believe, but ignore all of the other prophecies that were given equal weight by other groups at the same time.
well, also too, I think most Christians aren't aware of these early commentaries on prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls or extra
Right.
biblical stuff. So if you're a Christian looking back at this, it just makes sense. Oh, this is
Oh yeah.
special. It's this one case. It's obviously the way, but once you
I can't tell you how
look
many
at the
times
context, right?
at church people would be like, this obviously talks about Jesus. Can the Jews not read their own
How did
books?
they miss it?
Yeah.
How did
Yeah.
they miss it? Right. So
Yeah.
there's something else I think that's important to say in this vein here too, right? Um, so we see what I think this provides us a clearer sense of all those times that Paul or the gospel writers, in particular Matthew, all those times where they make a point of saying, I learned about this through reading the scriptures. What they're not saying is, I didn't know about anything beforehand and just was reading the Bible and poof, this idea came into my head. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, there's things in my lifetime that have happened, and I'm struggling to find or to apply meaning to what has happened, and I find that meaning in the text of scripture, and that's what's all important for Paul, for the writers of the gospels, and for all of Jews. If you could locate events in your lifetime that occurred, that were predicted by the ancient scriptures, that makes it significant. That means that God is working in God is working through the events that are transpiring. And I think
But
that's absolutely critical in terms of understanding why the Christian writers are so fixated on reconstructing the life of Jesus, essentially, out of the text of scripture.
I'm glad you brought that up, because just listening to it without that context, it sounds a little bit, and this isn't a video on mythicism, so we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but it sounds a little
No.
bit like what mythicists say, like, oh, they were looking about their scriptures and building a future from that out of whole cloth. But what you're saying is, no, they like had this experience, like, okay, and they use the scriptures like an interpretive framework for the things that they
Yeah.
had. They like look back and like, oh, this thing happened and it was predicted in the past, and here's where it was predicted.
Yep.
You can see that in the
So
"this was done in fulfillment" phrases too in the Gospels.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So something actually has to happen, right? For it to be a fulfillment of a prophecy. And I will so I'll say one more thing about this and then we'll move on. I think I like a month ago or 6 weeks ago, I put out a tweet. Well, I think this illustrates the point actually fairly abundantly clear. The founder, as far as we know, the founder of this community who wrote and collected the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, we're never told what his name is. He's given a moniker, the Teacher of Righteousness. All we know about the Teacher of Righteousness is what appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and all they seem to care about is how the events of his life were fulfillments of earlier scriptures. So they never talk about stuff that happened unless it was predicted by earlier scriptures.
But
So
Kipp, how do you know that guy was real?
right, like, well,
You can't
I
defeat
mean,
extreme skepticism, Kipp.
we don't, right? But as historians, you just there are many things that we just have to we have to accept as most likely. It seems pretty plausible that the way in which the Teacher of Righteousness is described as, fulfilling these Old Testament prophecies, not that the Old Testament prophecies actually have anything to do with them, but the way that he's described in their fulfillment of these texts, it just seems like a real guy. Like, why not, right? So should we talk about
Yeah, so now that we've taken the audience from prophecy all the way in the hazy days pre-Judaism, now we've reached Christianity. Let's look at a couple of very popular prophecies that are held up by modern Christians as fulfillments that are unique to Jesus. So they can not only did Jesus fulfill these prophecies, but this is one unique way you can know that the Christian story is true. And
And they're
probably
obvious too.
and it's obvious, it's
it's
unambiguous,
obvious?
right? And so one of the ones that I hear a lot is the virgin birth, which comes from Isaiah 7, or that's how they
Verse 14. Yes.
right. And so
Do you want to read it?
yeah,
The
so
prophecy. Want to tee this up?
Isaiah
Oh,
7. I'll start at verse 14 there. It says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, the virgin," and this is from the NIV. That's not the original Hebrew, but the NIV says, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He'll be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right."
Now, importantly, when this text is cited by Matthew, which is the only place it's cited, he doesn't talk about him eating curds. He just says that a virgin will conceive and will give birth, and his name will be Emmanuel. So I think importantly, Jesus' name was not Emmanuel, which
It was like a
is
nickname. It's fine.
as far as we know, nobody ever called him Emmanuel. There's no mention of
Those
him
are
being
details, okay? We don't worry about that.
Yeah, right. So, so what's going on here? And my friend Tyler Vela already kind of queued this up as well, in the chat here, didn't he? So Isaiah chapter 7:14. We need to do a little bit of background in order to understand this. What's going on in this text? We need to situate it historically. So, the book of Isaiah comprises 66 chapters. It's one of the largest books in the Hebrew Bible. It's not the largest book in the Hebrew Bible. Do you know what the largest book in the Hebrew Bible is by word count? Anybody in the chat? Let's
Is
see if
anybody in the
anybody
chat? No, my
Anybody
guess
have
is Psalms.
My guess
I'm
is
just-
Leviticus. Oh, Psalms is a good guess
Oh,
too.
wow. Leviticus, Psalms. Anybody in the chat have any guesses?
I don't see any. Okay.
They're all like sleeping.
Like, oh, what's going on here?
Wake up, you guys. So, the largest book by word count in the Hebrew Bible is actually the book of Jeremiah.
Oh, wow.
Oh wow,
It's my boy. Jeremiah.
Didn't know that.
Yep.
Oh, and there Simone says Jeremiah.
Oh,
I'm going to assume
yeah!
that they typed it before you said it.
let's do that. Yeah. Let's pretend that Simone was not cheating. You weren't cheating, were you, Simone?
Simone,
Okay. So,
yeah, she said
I
they were in time, so we believe you.
yes, I believe it. I know Simone a little bit from Twitter, so
100
yeah,
internet points to Simone.
that tracks. Isaiah is a book that's ascribed to this prophet from the late 8th, early 7th century, Isaiah ben Amoz. He was a priest closely connected to the royal house. He lived between 740 and 680 BCE, and he served in the administration of 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So most of his prophecies had to do with 2 things in particular, 2 political crises that were faced by. He lived in Jerusalem. I don't think I said that. So most of his prophecies have to do with 2 crises that were faced down by the city of Jerusalem in his lifetime. The first was the Syro-Ephraimite Wars, and these took place between 734 to 732 BCE. And the second was the invasion of the Assyrians under Sennacherib, which destroyed the kingdom of Israel and basically took Jerusalem and the surviving nation of Judah under vassalage to the Assyrians. So most of Isaiah's prophets all deal with these very real political crises. So I'll talk a little bit more about the formation of the book of Isaiah in a bit, because right now we're just focused on chapter 7, verse 14. So the Syro-Ephraimite War, Syria and the northern kingdom known as Israel, or as Samaria, or as Ephraim, they were plotting an invasion against Jerusalem. And this was as a result of Ahaz's refusal to join in a coalition with Syria and with the northern kingdom to go against Assyria. Wisely, Ahaz said, we don't stand a fucking chance against the Assyrians, so why would I do that? This pissed off the Syrians and the northern kingdom, so they actually came down and started preparing for an invasion of Jerusalem. This made Ahaz very nervous. So this prophecy in chapter 7, verse 14 is uttered kind of on while Ahaz is absolutely sweating it out about the forces from Syria and Ephraim, which are starting to gather on his northern border for this invasion. So Isaiah is dispatched by Yahweh in the first part of chapter 7. Yahweh says, go and talk to Ahaz and provide him this prophecy of encouragement. So, hey, can you guys read some stuff for me?
Sure.
If you can pull up Isaiah chapter 7.
Got it up.
All right, both of you. So Isaiah basically he offers this prophecy of hope to Ahaz, who's really down in the dumps about the fact that he thinks his kingdom is about to be ruined. So maybe Jared, if you could read verses 7 through 9 for me.
Can do.
This
And
is
I'm reading
what-
out
what-
yeah. I'll be reading out the New Revised Standard Version updated edition for you all.
Good. That's a good choice.
I'll use the same translation for consistency.
You suck up. Oh, sorry.
7 through 7 through what verse?
9. Just
Okay.
the 3 verses.
Therefore, thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass, for the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered, no longer a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you do not stand firm in faith, you shall not stand at all.
So basically, what he's saying to Ahaz is hold fast, be faithful. These entities, Syria and Israel, within 65 years, they're going to be done. It's going to be over. Importantly, interestingly, this is a prediction that came true, sort of. The nation of Israel came, was destroyed by the Assyrians, but it happened like 30 years earlier than than what Isaiah predicted. So I don't know, maybe that means he's like super great at the prophesying thing.
I think it's like Price is Right rules. As long as you don't go past, I think it's okay.
Right. That's it, right? I think that works.
And in context, the Assyrians are knocking on the door, right? Like they're coming down.
They're right there. Yeah. Like I mean, this is already a conflict that's about to, right? I mean, this is the reason it's so the situation for Israel and for Syria is so dire that because it's so dire that they decide they need to turn around and go south and beat the shit out of Ahaz for not joining their club in meeting the Assyrians on the battlefield. So that's the first part, but this is not the end of it. So Isaiah predicts the end of the northern kingdom. He's off by like 30 years, but in the good way. It happens earlier. So he's way to go, Isaiah. So then Isaiah instructs Ahaz to ask him for a sign to validate his prediction. So he basically says, this is, Israel's going to end, but you should ask for a sign to make sure that we know this is legit, right? And Ahaz is like, oh no, whatever Yahweh says, I'm good. I would dare not deign to question the word of Yahweh. And this seems to upset Yahweh, because it's like, well, you're going to get a sign anyways. And here is the sign. And Jordan, if you could read then verses 13 to 17.
Sure. So verse 13 picks up, then Isaiah said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. How far do you want me to go?
17.
Verse 17.
Okay. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on your ancestral house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria.
Dun, dun, dun. The king of Assyria is coming. So I kind of I don't know. I like the way this unfolds because Isaiah's like, he comes up to King Ahaz, and first of all, he's like, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be good. Just, check with me for a sign. And Ahaz is like, no, I can't do that. And then all of a sudden Yahweh's like, fuck you. And then he gives him this prophecy where he's like, wow, if you're too good for a sign, then I'm just going to bring the king of Assyria all the way down here to mess with you. But importantly, this has nothing to do. You'll notice when Jordan read the passage, this is not a virgin conceiving. This is a young woman. And the difference here is between two Hebrew words. The common word in Hebrew for virgin is betulah. And this is a woman who has not had sex with a man. The other word
which was very important, by the way.
Pretty important. Well, I mean, yes. Depending on the woman, if it was a respectable woman, it was important.
Yeah.
So this was the ideal. The word used by Isaiah is Alma. Now, there is some dispute about what this word means, about how to correctly translate it. I think the best evidence suggests that an Alma within this culture was a woman who had already had sexual intercourse, was, attached to a man, a married woman, but who had not yet given birth to a child. So this is a woman who's within a sexual relationship, but not yet has born children. So she is not a betula. She is not somebody who's not had her hymen broken yet. She's already within a sexual relationship. So who is this woman? I mean, a number of we don't know, right? And there are a number of interpretations. I think the majority of scholars think that Isaiah's basically brought his wife with him, and she's, probably pregnant, and he's pointing at her and saying, "Look, this woman is going to give birth to a child." And the important thing here, the sign, the thing that Yahweh is providing to Ahaz is that within 2 years, or is it 3 years? It's either 2 or 3 years. By the time the child basically knows good and evil, is the way that we think of we think of intellectual maturity in this instance. The sign is that by that time, both Syria and Israel are going to be in major trouble, right? So that's the majority interpretation. And before I ask your question or comment, Jared, I want to provide. I know I get accused all the time of always siding with the consensus, but here's an instance where I'm not on board with the majority interpretation. I think that the Alma is probably a member of Ahaz's household. She is probably a concubine or a wife, and when the child was born, they probably called him Emmanuel. So that's
so like Simone says that all of this that Isaiah is talking about is happening like right now. Isaiah is talking to the king about things that are happening today.
Now.
And Vishanti points out that the woman's is pregnant right now.
Yes.
Yeah. So to paint the picture, Ahaz is like, Yahweh's like, ask me for a sign. Ahaz is like, no, I'm not doing it. And then so Isaiah gets put on the spot. He's like, that woman over there, she's pregnant. Before she has a kid, like
she'll have the kid, and before he's grown up.
He's like 3 years old, right? Yeah. So this is all going to happen. And that's how you know that I'm telling the truth.
Right.
That's the message here. Isaiah is not making some kind of statement about the child. He's not making any kind of statement about the woman. He's making a statement about what's going to happen with regards to Syria and to Israel. That's the important point.
So I had a question about the word Alma and then the other one, which I don't remember. Betula. So obviously this is so there must have been a translation floating around that had already either altered this word, or where would that original Christian idea have come from?
I believe this comes out of the
was it Septuagint?
I believe so. Let me double check to make sure, because I think
that's what the New Testament
Septuagint
authors
is the
would have
one
had,
that
right?
actually translates it out as Parthenos. Sorry, I got Isaiah 7:14. So yeah,
and for those who don't know, the Septuagint is
the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Bible which was compiled, which was written and then compiled sometime in the second century BCE. There's some thought that now the way this kind of worked out, even though the Septuagint was translated by Jews for Jews, this was the text that was adopted by the Christians, the early church. So they preserved,
Makes
they
sense.
handed down the Old Testament in Greek after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. The only surviving group of the only surviving sect of Jews was the Pharisees, who basically became the rabbinic Jews, and they set a focus on what we now call the Masoretic text, which was a Hebrew text of the Bible. So this is sort of the history of how these different texts arrived to us in the modern day. The Masoretes and the Pharisees are preserving the Masoretic text. The Christians are preserving the Septuagint. There's a tiny little community of Samaritans surviving, and they preserve what's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's just the Pentateuch. So these are your primary versions of the text. And in the Greek text, the translator says dia taututo se kurios autos humin semeion idou he parthenos, and the word parthenos in Greek is a virgin. So whether or not this was quite often what happens is we have suspicions about the actual extent of Hebrew knowledge that some of the Septuagint translators have. Some of them seem to have known Hebrew really well, some of them much less well. This may be an instance where he just didn't have a great grasp of Hebrew when he was translating this and used this word parthenos in Greek, which means virgin, to translate Alma. That's a possibility. Others will suggest that this was a corruption that was introduced by Christians in later centuries to the manuscripts, and this is what survived in the Greek.
I think this is important because it highlights that if the early Christians were doing that thing where they're looking back at the text, here's a clear example of what the text they were looking at has already been altered from the original text. So
Mhm.
even there, the prophecy was something that wasn't even in the original text, and we can look at this example here.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I think I'll say one other thing here. We read, so when if you remember, you probably don't, but when I read the Melchizedek scroll, and I made a point. I within the Melchizedek scroll, it quotes Isaiah 61 verse 2, but it actually alters the text.
Mm.
Right. So when Matthew quotes Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 as fulfillment of this prophecy that Jesus will be born of a virgin girl. This is the text that he provides. He provides the Septuagint text. So the fact that the text was altered in fulfillment of a prophecy is not unusual. This is something that can happen, and that was not looked down upon either. This was totally accepted. So I think it's an unresolved issue. I don't know whether this is a Christian corruption or just sloppy translation on the part of the original Jewish translator of the Hebrew text, but I think either way it works.
So I should have probably prefaced this before we got into the fulfill prophecy thing, but in my view, if so, the argument being made is that this event happened, it was predicted prior to that, and the only way that prediction could have been made is if they had some kind of supernatural foreknowledge. That's the argument being made. And so for that specific argument to hold weight with me, I would think that the prediction needs to be specific, So there's only
Mhm.
one real clear interpretation, because if you make a vague, like, there will be wars and rumors of wars. Well, okay. Like, that's not
Right?
telling me much, It needs to be specific. It needs to actually have happened prior to the events that were fulfilled. And then the events themselves, it needs to be specific enough such that those events would not be something you could easily predict. Right. And then those
Right?
things need to have come past. That for me would
Yeah.
be the criteria for like a prophecy that's fulfilled in the relevant sense, in the sense that it would be some evidence speaking towards a supernatural or divine source, basically. And what's happening here is, this is a person who's speaking about what's happening right now today. It's not predicting what's happening hundreds of years later. And even the interpretation used, like, it's not specific, because he was saying young woman, not a virgin, not, so that one I think we can cross off the list as divine foreknowledge. Before we move,
DM Luca was a trilobite firmed wing. Mentions that Apologia has pretty good criteria for fulfilled prophecy. He's got 6.
yeah,
I encourage people to go and look them up. I did a video about this very subject on his channel, where he goes through these and we talk about some of these prophecies. So importantly, though, I think it's necessary to stress that within this period, I think this prioritizes, or this provides great incentive for people to be as ambiguous as possible if you're going to deign to be a prophet, right? By this period, um, in the early period, when prophecy was all just about advising the king and making pronouncements about what's going on in the present day, that's a different story. But by this time, by the time of Jesus, when Jews are starting to look back on their texts as predictions about what's going to happen to them now, um, and new texts are being written which tend to promote this idea as well. The latest text written in the Bible is the second half of the book of Daniel, where this is kind of the feature. Daniel is making these predictions after the fact about very specific things that are going to happen leading up to the 2nd century BCE. But then it's within his best interest to be as vague as possible about what is going to happen after his lifetime. And we
you
see
can
the
be
same thing
super
in the book
specific
of
looking
Enoch.
back. Yeah. Yeah.
We see the same thing in the book of Enoch. We see the same thing in the book of Jubilees. We see the same thing in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, which we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, or in the the Aramaic Levi document within the Dead Sea Scrolls, or within pseudo Daniel, or the Apocryphon of Jeremiah, or many of these other texts that nobody has ever heard of. They're doing the same thing. But they're all the other interesting thing is like prophecy and apocalypticism. We need to think of them as historical enterprises, right? They always start and they couch themselves. It's very important to couch yourself within actual history, within things that have actually happened. So that's where it starts. They're always forward looking, but after the fact. So I'm writing in the 2nd century, but I'm pretending that I'm writing in the 6th century and looking forward when I'm actually looking backwards. And I'm going to narrate everything that has happened up to my lifetime as if I was predicting it, so that when I actually get to my predictions, which are super vague and very imprecise and really open ended, they sound like just a continuation of what's happened before. And because all this stuff came true, you can trust what I'm telling you.
They'll use that method to actually date some of these writings as well, right?
Absolutely. Within the book of Daniel, we have a fairly precise we have a pretty clear idea of when these things were written. Everything like the prophecies of there's a couple of things that are going on. When Daniel talks about things that are happening in the 6th century, uh, he gets a lot of stuff wrong, which is weird because he supposedly lived in the 6th century, right? But then when you get to the 3rd and the 2nd century, he's incredibly precise about everything, all the way up until the death of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, which happened in 164 BCE. And then after the death of Antiochus, Daniel then makes a couple of predictions, fairly open-ended, but some sort of precise about, victory for Israel, rah, rah, God's coming back kind of thing. The dead are going to be raised. Poof, we're going to heaven. So he does this. And then, some of this stuff he just gets wrong. So scholars are able to look, oh, well, you clearly don't understand history until here, right? And you're good for this like 40-year period of time up to 164, where you predict the death of Antiochus IV. But then after that,
It'd be
I
like
wonder when it was written.
It'd be like
Yeah.
if a Q conspiracy site discovered writings or whatever, allegedly
Yeah,
from the
right.
18th century, and it got stuff about the 15th century, not so great. And then as it got up to Trump's presidency, it's like nailing everything, and then
Bang
suddenly
on.
it just goes off the rails. Yeah.
Right before
Before,
yeah.
yeah.
You got it.
Real quick, want to catch up on the chat. So Stephanie says that she loves watching you live, Kipp. She enjoys your channel,
Thank
but she
you,
does have
Stephanie.
one critique. Super
Uh-oh.
chat for $5 says that you need a bow tie to really tie it together.
No! No!
So take that.
I will wear a tie-dye hoodie before I wear a bow tie.
And DM says a mustache. So
Yeah.
that might be more doable. I don't know.
I used to have one. I won't pull up the pictures, but maybe, next month is Movember, right? Maybe I'll
Yeah,
grow
we
a
should do
mustache.
that.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
we
You
should-
and you
should
and
we do
Jared
it?
can.
Yeah.
We could have a
plot that
race.
down. Yes. I would not want to race
No.
Jared in growing facial hair.
I won't race him either, but
That's a
I'm
fool's errand.
I'm a good sport. You know what's weird though is I grow facial hair here and here, but nothing here and nothing here.
Have you seen
So-
Joe Dirt? The movie with David Spade.
No, I haven't seen that one.
So he grows facial
Very-
hair like
Is
that.
it-
He's like,
Yeah,
you mean to tell
same
me it
pattern.
goes in all
Yeah.
white trashy like that on its own? It's like,
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I like to think of it. Hockey season has started. I like to think of it as the Erik Karlsson look.
There you
Erik
go.
Karlsson was a future Hall of Fame defenseman for the Ottawa Senators and then the San Jose Sharks. He's playing in Pittsburgh right now, so it's the Erik Karlsson look, guys. It's gold.
One last thing from Stephanie. She pointed out that everyone in the chat seems to be very knowledgeable in this stuff. So that's great. I'm glad that we've got a good community building here. But anybody who's watching who's like, I didn't know any of this stuff, don't feel bad. This is a very highly self-selected group. And this is as like just skeptics, this is why we talk to experts, right? Because you can't possibly know everything. Why would you just walk off the street knowing this stuff, So that's why we have people like Kipp on, so that we can
And I just hope people learn things, right? Like,
yeah.
even if you don't feel like you're I hope you're learning stuff, Stephanie.
So moving on to probably arguably I'd say the single best, or the one that is perceived at least as the best by modern Christians, the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. This is one that whenever the topic of prophecy comes up, this is one that is always pointed to. And if you're just like reading it, and anyone who's been to church for any length of time has heard it, it's kind of sounds like Jesus just on the face of it, right? And he's talking about that he'll be
Why?
the Lord will crush him with his affliction. He'll be bruised for our transgressions. These sort of punishment motifs. And if you're just reading it just as that, and then they're putting it next to Jesus, I'm sure it sounds an awful lot like crucifixion.
So I get these ads on my YouTube ad selection. I get these all these ads from this Jewish Messianic group called One for Israel. I don't know if you guys have seen these, but this is kind of they're a Christian, they're a Messianic Jewish organization.
So Christians.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. So and this is their big pitch, right? It's like any Jew who cracks open their Tanakh and they look at Isaiah chapter 53, it's obviously talking about Jesus. How could you miss it? It's right there. So there's a lot to get into here. And I think the place to start is just how to understand Isaiah 53 within the book of Isaiah. We'll start there, and then we'll talk a little bit about the text itself. So, if you're unaware, the book of Isaiah is as I mentioned, it's 66 chapters. Isaiah ben Amoz lived in the late 8th, early 7th centuries, and this is a text that appears to be attributed to him. Now, the reason I say that is because the entire text of the book of Isaiah, and this may surprise some people, the entire text of the book of Isaiah is basically written in the third person, in a manner of speaking. So I should qualify that. So there are first person oracles throughout the first 34 chapters thereabouts. They're first person oracles. A speaker is saying, this is what I saw, this is what Yahweh communicated to me, but he never self-identifies. There are 6 places within the first half of Isaiah, between chapter 1 through 33, where there's like what we call a proscription or an introduction to an oracle, which says, this is the vision of Isaiah ben Amoz that he saw during the reign of Uzziah when he was in the temple, or he saw during the reign of Ahaz after he dug a well. It provides these contexts. So right from the start, I think it's important to point out that just on a surface level, you can look at this text and see that this isn't just Isaiah writing this stuff down and then he's done with it. There are people who are coming along and providing editorial, even just minor. If you're extremely conservative, you should be able to accept that. People came along later and provided editorial framing to the work of Isaiah. So the way critical scholars view the entire book is that a lot of this stuff probably comes from the 7th, 8th century. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which we read, stems from the time period of Isaiah, was probably, might have been a prophecy uttered by the actual Isaiah in the court of Ahaz. All of this stuff is restricted to the first 34, 35-ish chapters of Isaiah. And the reason for seeing this stuff together is that it's all concentrated thematically on the same stuff. It all has to do with the Sour Ephraimite War, which makes sense because this occurred, in the late 8th century, and it has to do with the Assyrian invasion of Israel and the threat of Assyria to Jerusalem in later years, which happened in the very early 7th century. Did I get that right? Yeah, I think I got that right. Anyways,
We'll
sorry,
right.
that's all 8th century too. Sorry. Anyways, so the way scholars look at this is that this stuff all probably dates back to this time period, but then there's a strange thing that happens at the end of chapter 35. The prophecies end, and then chapters 36 through 39 is just narrative. It's a story of King Hezekiah and Isaiah. It's like 3 or 4, it's like 4 chapters. And interestingly, it's also lifted verbatim out of Second Kings. So it's not even original. It literally is a word for word recreation. It's just cut and pasted. There's some minor variations, but it's the same text basically appearing in this section of Isaiah. And the way scholars tend to look at this is that this probably was like originally one single individual book. Uh, Isaiah's followers, he had admirers later in life who started writing down stuff that he said. They collected it together, and then they put the whole thing into a collection, and they added this narrative conclusion to it, and that's that. There's reasons for thinking that, which have to do. I won't get into it, but there's compositional reasons for thinking that. So that's Isaiah chapter 1 to 39.
How'd they copy and paste that keyboard, Kipp? Debunked.
Well,
Checkmate,
yeah.
skeptics.
You've got one here,
Fake news.
another here, and you do it the old-fashioned way, right? So, so that's what scholars call first Isaiah or proto Isaiah, written in the late 8th, early 7th century BCE. And then the next section of Isaiah starts in chapter 40 and goes to chapter 55. This is what's called Deutero or second Isaiah. And there's a very obvious shift in the rhetoric and the way in which the text starts to unfold. No longer are these first person, like remember Isaiah speaking in the first person, even though he's speaking anonymously. This is all gone. It's not this. It's now just third person sort of narration talking about what's happening, around the writer. This section of text is centered on a collection of individual poems. There's 4 of them. They're called the servant songs. These are Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 to 4, 49, verses 1 to 6, 50, verses 4 to 11, 52, verses 13 through 53, verse 12. And these are deeply moving, very very well constructed poems in which Israel as a nation is featured and analogized as thus servant of Yahweh, and we see this explicitly in a few places. In Isaiah 41 verse 8 and in 43 verse 10. I'm just going to pull that up here quickly. 41 verse 8, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking to you about, what I'm talking about here. So here 41, this is the so this is before the actual servant songs. This oracle starts, who has roused the victor from the east, summoned him from service. I'm starting in verse 2. He delivers up nations to him and tramples kings underfoot. He makes them like dust with his sword. He drives stubble with his bow. He peruses them and passes on safely, scarcely touching the path with his feet. Who has performed and done this? Calling the generation from the beginning, I, Yahweh, am first, and I will be with the last. The coastlands have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. They have drawn near to me. Each one helps the others, saying one to another, take courage. The artisan, am I in the right text? Sorry. Oh yeah, I'm going to verse 8.
Yeah.
Okay. The artisan encourages the goldsmith, and the one who smooths with the hammer encourages the one who strikes the anvil, saying of the soldering, it is good, and they fasten it with nails so it cannot be moved. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. So that's the NRSV. This is the introduction to the servant songs, where the servant is clearly identified as the nation of Israel, or I would say at a minimum as a segment of, as a portion of what, people who identify themselves as Israelites, who's like going to be the future of the kingdom. So this is kind of the focus of Second Isaiah. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Jordan.
I was gonna say, a while back, a friend of mine uh, was brought up this proof as reason why Christianity was true, and I'd heard the Isaiah thing before, but I hadn't delved into it post deconversion, right? And he was
Mhm.
like, "This is clear evidence," and I was because he's like, "This is a servant, and there's only one way to interpret this servant. It's clearly Jesus because it doesn't say who this servant is." And I was like, "Okay, well, let me check." And then I'm like, I read 53. I was like, "Okay, well, let me look at the context." And went back a few chapters. I was like, wait a minute, it tells you exactly who it is.
It tells you who the servant is, right? So there's four of these songs. They're all very similar to one another. They're all written about, they're personifications of Israel. Um, and the theme of the servant songs tends to be that Israel is now, and this is how we tend to know that these were written at a much later period of time and not in the 8th 7th century BCE, because it would be weird for Isaiah to write about, all the painful turmoil of the people of Israel living in a foreign land, and mourning the destruction of the temple. I mean, Isaiah looks out his window and goes, yeah, the temple's right there. It's good.
Yeah,
We're okay.
yeah.
Right? So, I mean, yeah, I used to joke when I was in grad school. I had a buddy, and we had classes together. We used to joke about this. We're like, oh, I'm Isaiah. I'm writing these prophecies. I have no idea what any of this means, but I just feel like I have to keep writing this stuff. This makes no sense at all. I mean, but whatever. This is God telling me to write this stuff that doesn't make any sense. I better keep it. I better write it down. And no doubt everybody for like 150 years is going to continue to preserve this stuff that doesn't
That
make any
make
sense
any sense? Has no
within this.
relevance.
No, like that doesn't happen. Like
Right.
I mean, it's very cost within the ancient world. There's an enormous commitment of resources to just writing stuff down.
Yeah.
You only write stuff down if it's going to be useful and meaningful to you. So any of this stuff that like has nothing to do with what's going on, you're gonna you're gonna toss it. You're gonna go, whatever. I've got better things to focus on. So, within the context of the servant songs, Isaiah like 40 through 55, it's written from. It seems to be written outside of the land of Israel. It's focusing on Jerusalem out there. So most scholars tend to think these were written by the exilic community in exile in Babylon, and self-reflecting on their plight as a means of atonement. And atonement in the like in the natural sense, in the actual sense of the word, this is, they believe that their sufferings are basically a sacrifice on behalf of the sins of former generations. So the former generations were evil. They displeased Yahweh. Yahweh has punished them by, you know, ending the Davidic line. Remember,
Mhm.
exiling us and sending us off to this foreign land, destroying the temple. Uh, so here we are. We are serving the punishment. We are the atonement. Our suffering is going to provide for making things right in the future. So it's always, this is the stuff that's forward looking. of course, within Isaiah as well, it's important to note that there's specific datable stuff here. There is clear mention of Cyrus the Great, who is a Persian ruler in the 6th century. Isaiah identifies him by name and calls him the Messiah of God. So all of this makes historical sense within the the Babylonian exile, kind of at the point in which Cyrus is making inroads into Babylon and starting to
Yeah.
establish the Persian Empire, right?
Talking
So
about
that's
buttering up the authorities there.
right. There you
Yeah.
go. So much of this stuff, I think, and I haven't chilled for like at least an hour and a half now. So when the title of my course that's offered through Myth Vision MVP courses is Real Israelite Religions, Facts on the Ground, and Propaganda in the Bible. And this is the kind of stuff that I go into. It's really important to try and set your focus on like there's a political realia within these texts, which were by and large collected by people who were like politically active, like
The
these were
elite.
power
Yeah.
brokers, right? So they had interest in the goings on around them, so of course they're going to write royal propaganda or write propaganda about whatever ruler they're trying to suck up to. Like this is just how this literature works. So that's second Isaiah. I'll just introduce third Isaiah, and then you can say something, Jordan. We'll get into Isaiah 53. So third Isaiah, there's another shift that takes place between chapter 55 and chapter 56, where suddenly there's a temple again, the second temple. It's built. The writer is in the temple courts. He's writing within Jerusalem. He's talking about this restored kingdom of Judah. So scholars look at this and go, well, these are prophecies that were, uttered or written, after the exile. Once these people have come back into Judah, have started to rebuild Jerusalem, have rebuilt the temple, they have this, they're feeling pretty good about themselves. They have these hopeful expectations about the future of their nation. These are reflected in what's called Trito or third Isaiah. So basically what you're looking at here, you've got Isaiah writing in the late 8th, early 7th century. You've got like 150 year break until the exile, sometime between 586 and the construction of the temple, the second temple, in 515 BCE. That's when second Isaiah was written. It was written in Babylon. And then third Isaiah is written sometime after 515 BCE, after the second temple has been built, and it provides for this hopeful expectation of this new nation. Okay, go. And then we'll talk about Isaiah 53.
One thing that I definitely wanted to touch on, and we're at 2 hours, so I want to get
sorry
to.
about that.
No worries. I just want to get to a conclusion. But one thing I wanted to make sure we touched, and I don't know why I swear my screen is green, not blue. So
It looks good to me.
one thing that I definitely want to touch is you have to remember when someone like Matthew is writing these texts, they, like you said, they have events that they're trying to rationalize or put in context. They have these prophecies in front of them when they're writing this story. It's not like so the only way we know where Jesus was born, or the only way we know Jesus allegedly said X, Y, or Z, is because these people who have the prophecies in one hand and the story in the other are the ones telling us, right? And so you can't rule out the possibility that the story itself was written in such a way to ensure that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. So that's another like kind of epistemic possibility you have to keep in mind if you're going to use these as proof for the supernatural.
Yep. Sorry, my wife is just coming home, so things are there's dog craziness in my house for
It's okay.
for a minute or two. So yes, that's absolutely right. So importantly, I want to something else I want to point out is Isaiah 53 is interesting because it gets promoted as this like death knell. This is the proof of fulfilled prophecy. Very interestingly, within the New Testament, if you look at the New Testament carefully, I don't really think that this is a prophecy. You'll notice that throughout the Gospels, there is only one citation of Isaiah 53, and that occurs in Matthew 8, verse 17. He cites Isaiah 53, verse 4. That's the only place where anything from Isaiah 53 is directly cited.
And Matthew
Within
talks about
all
prophecy all the time.
right, yes. So
that's his thing.
Yeah.
But what does happen is, and this is sort of the nature. We talked a little bit about this, and I'll mention this again. What's happening within the Gospels is they are the Gospel writers are Jewish, or at least very very familiar with Judaism and with the Jewish scriptures. They are reading them, and then they're using them to contextualize the life of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and the mission of Jesus. So what you do see throughout the Gospels are not prophecies so much as they are echoes of Scripture. But it's like the same sort of thing like we see. One of my favorite examples is the Gospel of Luke. Basically constructs his story of Jesus on the model in 1 Kings chapter 18 through 2 Kings chapter 10. The stories of Elijah and Elisha provide like the template. That's the structure for his retelling of the story of Jesus. And it's patently obvious. Like when you sit down with the Gospel of Luke next to these stories of Elijah and Elisha, you can literally like read them side by side and see the same thing happening. But I mean, that's kind of what all the gospel writers and then Paul is doing with Isaiah 53. He sees that this has something to do with promoting the ideas of who Jesus was and what he did. But Matthew is the only one who comes right out and says, this is what Isaiah said, and it was fulfilled in the life of Jesus. And he says that only of Isaiah 53, verse 4. So I like to say that this song provides texture to the story, particularly the story of Jesus's arrest and death. Now, I'll just go through a little bit of this fairly quickly. There's lots of parts. I mean, and that tends to be the focus. There's lots of parts within Isaiah 53 which look like they align perfectly with Jesus, right? And of course, that's by design because the writers have Isaiah 53 open and they're writing their story to align with what appears in Isaiah 53. But importantly, there are some significant differences. Problematically, the servant in Isaiah 53 is depicted in several places. Verses 3 to 4, verses 10, he's depicted as being very sick. He's got physical ailments. Like he's frail. He's not a well person, and he's
so much that other people have to look away from him. Like,
right. Yeah,
this-
he's exactly. This doesn't really fit with the gospel presentation of Jesus. Perhaps even more problematically, in verse 10, Isaiah 53 says that the servant will see his offspring, his children, literally. If we're trying to do as much justice as we can to the text within their original context, this can only mean that the servant actually sees his children. And if this is a personification of Israel, I actually have my wife put a dog here in the room with me, so thanks, Lisa.
We love dogs.
I have there's probably like 6 of them in my house right now. So, anyways,
That is many dogs.
that is a lot. This is, and within the context of what the servant songs are, this is basically the nation of Israel seeing the next generation of those people who are going to continue the kingdom, right? So, it's now what the way I think about this text, it's not just the personification of Israel. Within the context in which this was written during the exile, very interestingly, careful observers will notice that throughout the servant songs, there are echoes of other texts too. In particular, the servant songs appear to be riffing off of another prophet. The prophet Jeremiah, who lived during the end of the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. He watched the conquest and the destruction of the temple and the exile. He watched all this happen. There are a number of texts within Jeremiah, in particular in chapters 11 through 20, which are called the Confessions. And they're called this because Jeremiah spends a lot of time, and he's pretty vile. He spends a lot of time complaining about all the things that people are doing wrong. He's very fiercely critical of the kings of Jerusalem, rightly so, because it's kind of a gong show leading up to the exile, leading up to the conquest of Babylon there. So he's very frustrated by that. But he's also persecuted by members of the aristocracy because of things that he's loudly proclaiming about the king. So there within the book of Jeremiah, there are these so-called confessions, or these deeply personal introspections about the suffering that he is enduring on behalf of the message that he is delivering to Yahweh. I don't think we won't take the time to read them, but if you look at a couple of texts, Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 to 6, this is the second servant song. If you read that alongside of Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5 to 10, which is Jeremiah's own calling to be a prophet, you're going to see a clear relationship between these two texts. They look very, very similar to one another. Jeremiah famously says that he has been called out of the womb. This is a phrase that is then used in Isaiah chapter 39. More significantly, Isaiah chapter 53, verses 7 to 8, where the text says that the servant is led like a lamb to the slaughter, and he's silent and he doesn't say anything. This is a direct reflection of something Jeremiah says about himself in Jeremiah 11, verse 19, and then in Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 7 to 9. He echoes the same sort of sentiments about how he's quiet before his accusers intentionally. So the way that I look at the servant songs are thusly. Whoever's writing them has the book of Jeremiah in front of them, and he's looking at texts that are already there in Jeremiah, and he's using that. So he's using he's using the figure Jeremiah and his sufferings as a prophet, and kind of as a projection of what this servant is, who is a representation now of all of Israel in its suffering on behalf of the whole nation. So
to
did we
read
kill it?
Yeah, to read all of that
Yeah.
back. So first of all, the suffering servant, even though it does sound like Jesus, kind of, if you're reading it, it's talking about him being bruised for iniquities, all those sort of things. They identify explicitly who the servant is. The servant is Israel. The servant is like a personification of Israel. The book
Yeah.
itself, the structure is based on previous prophets. But even if you wanted to say it had a dual meaning, it was talking about the present and then also the future. If you want to go that route, you have to remember that the gospel writers had Isaiah in front of them, or knew it at least. And so when they're writing Matthew, when they're writing their own gospel, they're doing it with this in mind. And it doesn't, I think it's important to point out that doesn't necessarily mean they were lying or making anything
No,
up, because for
no.
them, that like you said earlier, when they're just like Jews were at the time, this happened today. I'm going to go look for scripture to like augment or to justify or to frame the things that I know, right? So they
Yeah,
say,
exactly.
right. And so they're like, oh, Jesus suffered. That's just like this, just that they were talking about in Isaiah. Let me make that clear by structuring my story that way. Does that
Exactly.
all read correctly?
Yeah, that's all good.
Yeah.
Now I'll say a couple other things about like the structure of the book of Isaiah. We have several copies from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very interestingly, um, the evidence that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to reflect already like this idea that this is not just all one continuous prophecy from Isaiah ben Amoz. It seems to be surviving in a couple different forms and possibly already understood or understood by the people who were copying these texts as a collection not just of the prophecies of Isaiah, but also these other prophecies that were uttered later. Um, we have, among most of the copies, we have a few of the entire book, but most of them preserve either only the first half or only the second half. And then something else I'll point out within the Gospel of Matthew, and this is something that most people miss. Matthew, whenever he quotes from Isaiah, says this was mentioned by the prophet Isaiah. But then there's one place, I think it's in Matthew chapter 23. I'm going to get the reference wrong, but there's one place where he provides a quotation from Isaiah 65 or 66. And but the way he introduces it, he says, this was said by the prophets. So what is Isaiah reading? Does he have, a book of Isaiah that only has like first Isaiah? And then he's got this other collection of, anonymous prophecies that appear within, the second half of Isaiah, and understands these to be exactly what they are: anonymous prophecies uttered by anonymous prophets.
Interesting. So he may not have
Yeah,
even
right.
had Isaiah as we currently have it today.
I think maybe not. There's some other weird things happening in Matthew too, which make me think that he's got different arrangements of prophets. There's famously he misattributes a quotation from Zechariah to Jeremiah, and this may just be a mistake. It may be this weird intentional cryptic thing that he might be playing 4D chess, or
He's next level
or
over here.
right, yeah, or another possibility we have to entertain is that he's reading a scroll where the prophecies of Zechariah are included with prophecies of Jeremiah and all attributed to him. This is kind of how this works.
That reminds me of a thing that Bart Ehrman mentions from his school days, where he was doing a paper on, I think it was Mark, and like Mark says X, but it actually the other sources say Y. And so he wrote this whole long paper about like trying to, well, maybe it was always this, and he got an A, but he said the professor wrote in the margins like, sure, or maybe Mark just made a mistake. And
Maybe.
Ehrman's like, that's so much simpler. Why didn't I think of that? Yeah. Well, I think so. We're coming up on 2.5 hours, so I want to hit the one
Yeah.
super chat we have and then wrap up. So we had a question, $10 from Henry Morant. He says, sorry, I'm a bit behind, but doesn't Daniel get his prediction of Antiochus IV Epiphanes' death wrong? It says he will die in Israel, but he actually
Right.
died in Persia.
That's right. Yes. So, and this is a very good point. Yes. The writer of the book of Daniel is not a great historian. So he's and even in terms of his retelling of events that are close to him, even though he's going to get stuff like very closely accurate, close to his time. There are, there are a few instances which show to us that he was mistaken about the broad strokes of what was taking place. So yeah, there's a good example of him getting the precise details of Antiochus's death wrong. So yeah.
that mistake in Daniel would be very concerning for a certain conception of the Bible that's common in Christianity today. It wouldn't necessarily be a problem for ancient Jews or even modern Jews. We're actually going to be talking about that topic with Vashanti. Date to be determined, because I owe her a outline, so that's on me. She's waiting on me. But we are going to be talking
Very
about
exciting.
anti-Semitism in atheism, and specifically ways which atheists kind of use their Christian goggles when they're looking at Judaism. So that's coming up next week. Very excited. Thanks partially to Dr. Kipp for getting us connected. We're going to be talking to Dr. Josh about slavery.
Wait a minute. Wait. Oh, I was going to say, is it going to be about slavery?
Yeah, of course it is. It's Dr. Josh. Like, what else would he talk about, right?
I'm sure he's interested in
it,
other topics. Yeah.
Right. But we're going to be talking about slavery, specifically like in the context of the ancient Near East, contrasting biblical slavery to that, and then also to today. So that is going to be next week. So that's what we've got going on. Please do subscribe if you're interested in that, so you don't miss anything. If you wanted to see any of those early, I would say see the Patreon, but we don't have that time travel thing figured out yet, so we can't do live streams early. But if you want to see our pre-recorded stuff early, you can see our Patreon. Or if you want to see Dr. Kipp stuff, you can go to his Patreon. So remind everyone, we talked about it earlier, but remind everyone what you've got coming up, Kipp, so they can be on the lookout for that.
All right. So I am actually, it'll probably be after the weekend, but I will be publishing a new video, interestingly, all about the book of Daniel and the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls for the book of Daniel, because I keep hearing all this this misinformation from apologists about how the Dead Sea Scrolls absolutely prove that Daniel could not have been written in the 2nd century BCE, and that is just patently false. In fact, what the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us about the book of Daniel is fascinating and very interesting, and actually helps us to understand the construction and the development of this book fairly close in time to when the last parts of it were being written. So that will be coming out in a few days, but maybe not until after the weekend. And then, of course, there's a Star Wars video waiting over on my Patreon if you're super interested. So
very exciting.
And then, I'll say one other thing. I think it's on October 27th. I will be appearing on Potential Theism. This is a new-ish YouTube channel. He's rather narrowly set his scope on the writings and the ideas of one Richard C. Carrier.
Yes.
I have been asked to come on his channel along with the excellent Dr. James McGrath, and we're going to be discussing Richard Carrier's last word vomit screed, all about how terrible critics have been of his work.
Well,
so that's coming on October 27th.
No critic of his work has ever understood it. That's the problem.
No, so, we don't get it. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks everyone for sticking to the end, because you made it all the way.
Thank you for staying awake.
Yeah. Impressive, particularly for those
late for you guys.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's only 11:30, and that's like 2 hours before my bedtime.
Don't you have like some nuclear physics thing to do over in the middle of the night?
I keep all of that at work. I don't do nuclear physics at home usually. But what we do here, though, at the end is we talk about a bias or a fallacy. So today's bias of the day is the priming bias. And this bias, I think, is kind of tangentially related to what we're talking about. It's kind of like that effect where you buy like a Honda Civic and then suddenly you see Honda Civics everywhere, you know? The priming bias or priming effect
My
is
son just
when,
bought one, by the way.
yeah,
There you
there
go.
you go. See? And now you'll be primed to see them everywhere.
I,
So
I know.
when you are presented with information, the human brain, being a pattern-seeking organ, has a tendency to look for connections with everything else you see around you. And this is something that can be measured, and it's something you have to keep in mind when you're like doing experiments or something. That, for instance, if they do polls, they have to be careful with the way that they phrase their questions, because they don't want to, or that they'll do like the same question before and after some information, so they don't prime, you know. And so, as skeptics, this is something we should be aware of ourselves, that the thing we have recently seen can inform our perceptions. And we also should be aware when we're looking at evidence from a survey or something like that, that, you know, some of the questions we can ask is, did they take priming into effect? What order did they ask these questions? And all those sort of things are relevant. So there's your bias.
Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thanks again for sticking all the way to the end. Really appreciate it. Subscribe to both our channels so you can see our stuff coming up. And until next time, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.
Peace out.